So my name's Amy Gutcher, and at Sumerian Foundation we are doing impact first investing. So this is where we're making investments in social enterprises where the primary purpose is the social impact. I think with the social finance, the thing to keep in the back of your mind is that it's a really broad range of different meanings for different people. But the underlying theme throughout it all is we're talking about making an impact, a social impact for people and planet. So I think this comes back to this idea that it's actually quite a broad range of possibilities. So at the heart of it, it's a resource, it's money that social enterprises or charities need in order to grow and improve their impact. So, you know, an example might be a loan, an example might be equity, but there are other things in between, and I could sort of use all the jargon and talk about quasi-equity or guarantees and those sorts of things, but at the heart of it is that it's not just one thing. It can be many things, including grants. It's just whatever's affordable and appropriate to that social enterprise. I think the thing with finding an investor is it's really a partnership. So it's kind of like any relationship. You want to find somebody who is aligned with your values and who you trust and can have an open conversation with. So I would say that whenever you're thinking about growing or thinking about, oh, I might need extra cash or funding in order to carry out my plans, I think that's a good time to start talking to different investors so that you can start building that relationship and working out who's the one that you want to work with, because it will be a long-term relationship. So finding the right person for you is ideal. It's really a two-way process. So often, like for us, when we first meet somebody, we want to understand them and where they've come from and where they want to go. And then there'll probably be part of it where we look at their finances, and everybody's at a different stage with that. Some people have done big financial forecasts and some people don't have anything. But we'd work on it together to work out, well, what's the appropriate thing for you? And in some cases it would be grant funding. But in other cases it's that actually what they really need is something that's a bit like equity, like a really long-term, patient, flexible kind of funding. There's always some that are at a stage where they just need a loan and it might not be particularly long-term. So it's a two-way process of working out what everybody's comfortable with and what works for everybody. Obviously, again, it's just completely dependent on different social enterprises, but usually the way that I see cash at the bank is that's part of your day-to-day operations. That's your, we call it working capital. So you need to have cash in the bank because it tends to go up and down as you dip into it and comes out. When we're talking about investment, we tend to be looking towards the future and about growth. So you might have cash in the bank now that works for your day-to-day operations, but depending on what it is that you want to grow, if you look forwards, you might need a different type of money that might work in a different kind of way. So that's why even if you've got cash in the bank, you might still be thinking about taking on investment. Yeah, so it's often about building capacity. So because one of the hardest things if you're running a social enterprise, there's many hard things, but one of the hard things is that in order to grow, you often need the capacity before you grow. So you might need you might need a finance person internally. You've never had one before, but it's very difficult to start paying for a finance person before you've grown to the level where you're generating the income. So often the sorts of investments that we're doing are really about building that internal capacity ready for the growth. And that's why you need funding upfront and then paying it back over the long term. Coming back to that idea of being aligned with your investor, you should be with an investor who is wanting to do the right thing for you. So the way that you tend to with, say, a loan, is looking at the repayment terms. It is structure it in such a way that there's risk in everything, but it's not too risky for a charity or social enterprise. And particularly when you come back to the fact that all of this is about increasing social impact, that in some way means that you sort of take a calculated risk in order to grow that social impact, because the benefits are so great to doing it. But it wouldn't be too risky unless it was terribly structured to take on a loan. Well, yeah, it's a chicken and egg. At some point, you have to make the step if you want to get to the bigger stages. But I don't think that's the case either. I think that probably what's happened in the sector in the past is that larger organisations have found it easier to attract social investment of whatever kind, perhaps because they're seen as lower risk by investors. But I think that actually, and the area that Sumerian works in, is the smaller organisations that have some track record but needs help to make that sort of next step. So when I talk about small, I'm talking about turnover around 200,000 a year. That kind of level, you might only have, say, 2 employees, or a very small team. And I think that's actually the sweet spot for social investment, because that's where you can really catalyse something and help them grow over the long term and be with them through what is going to be a bumpy journey to get to those larger sizes where then you'd be able to attract more social investment then as well. And there's loads of jargon in finance in general, and sometimes we use the same word for different things, and sometimes different things have the same word. And blended finance is a way of describing receiving money, because that's what it often is money, but receiving it in different ways. So, for example, part of the money could be given as grants, so you don't repay anything. Part of it could be repayable to the investor, but only under certain circumstances, and part of it could be repayable in regular chunks. So blended finance just means that it's a mixture of different things. I guess I would say, like, mentioning the jargon, it's a little bugbear of mine, because I think it makes it all sound very mysterious. But at the end of the day, it's just money, and the key thing is about the social impact and how we help social enterprises grow. So don't get bamboozled by jargon. I think there's a good place for grants in everything. There's a spectrum of social finance, and you could say at one end is grants where it's being given out and with no expectation of being repaid, and at the other end it's just pure finance where I want everything back with a financial return, and then this sort of spectrum in between. But I think there's still a good role for grants. I think what investors need to consider is the way that we give grants, and not making it short-term and restricted, but allowing and trusting social enterprises and charities to know what they're doing. And then our job as investors is to just make sure that it's affordable and appropriate to what they need. So there's definitely still a place for grants. I don't know, really. In many ways, I think that it's always good for a CEO or a board of an organisation to be thinking to the future and what your future needs might be. So I don't think there's really ever a time where you don't sort of like keep in the back of your mind at what point might we think about investment. But I guess the other consideration to have with investment is that it is time consuming. It is back to that sort of finding a new relationship, and the amount of time it takes to, or like the fairy tale, you have to kiss a lot of frogs to find your prince. So I think that if you bear that in mind, there is a time commitment to building relationships. But I wouldn't want to say that in a way of putting anybody off going down that route. I think that you can do it, and it could be appropriate any time for your organisation.